So we were talking about some of the behind-the-scenes people on Starsky and Hutch. Let's talk about Leonard Goldberg, one of the executive producers. Excuse me.
I think before Leonard was a producer, I think he was at the network. You know, it's interesting how we went through a period where the network people would become independent producers, and then we went through a period where the agents would become producers, and then the writers were becoming producers. Leonard was a very pleasant man. That's what he was a pleasant man, I think, until he lost his temper, but I never saw him lose his temper. I just heard about it. But he was, you know, they were in it for a different reason than I was in. You know? Their priorities were different.
Were he and Aaron Spelling on the set much?
No.
Was
Rarely came to the set.
Joseph Narr, was he on set?
Joe Narr was our line producer.
Talk a little about him.
Joe was a character. He left us this past year. Joe was he'd try to play David and I off against each other, you know, like that. But he was, you know, his heart was in the right place, and he really cared. But he was also from that old school.
Did you work with? Oh, did you have something else? Did you have something else to say?
No.
Did you work with the creator William Blinn?
No.
No.
But I wish I had. I think years later, before they did the movie of Starsky and Hutch, there was some talk about how they were having trouble figuring out what to do or how to do it, and Warner's was going to lose their option. And I called Bill, and I ran an idea past him, and we really had a lovely conversation. I like Bill a lot.
What was the idea for a movie?
I had, I can't remember offhand, but I had written, I can't remember what it was.
What did you think of the movie that was made in 2004?
You know, my stock answer is it's a compliment when you've done something that was iconic enough to, and successful enough to make a movie of it. I think I like Ben and Owen very much as people, and I think Ben is a really good mime and a good actor. I think Owen is too. I think that I sat with Ben, we had lunch, and I asked him, you know, what do you want to do? Do you want to do a spoof? Do you want to do something? Do you want to try to recapture that relationship? You can't go back to the 70s because the 70s was a much more gullible time, a much more naive time. But do you want to go find that relationship? And he said, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to do that. We want to do that. Well, the director they had wasn't in his wheelhouse. And so they ended up doing the film they did. It's a compliment. I enjoyed seeing it. I enjoyed, you know, sure, why not? But we worked one day there, David and I, and the routine was that he's talked me into showing up with my car to replace Ben's car that he's driven off a pier or something. So I'm the reluctant donor. And at one point, I give Ben the keys, and he's walking over to the car, and I'm paralleling him, walking to the other side of the car, and telling him, you know, how to do the clutch and how to do this, that, and the next thing. And the radio goes off. So I said to the director, I said, you know what would be fun is if we both dive in, me through the passenger window, he through the driver's window, and grab the phone at the same time. And we had that moment. And the director turned to me and he says, you wouldn't do that. End of story.
Yep. Had you seen David Soul in a while when you did that, or was it nice to reunite with him?
It's always nice to see Davey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the original cast, starting with David Soul as Hutch.
What do you want to talk about? What do you want to know?
Well, let's talk about the relationship between Starsky and Hutch, and your chemistry with David on set. A little bit more about that.
Well, my chemistry with David, interestingly enough, was very much about what happened in front of the camera. Off camera, we didn't have a whole lot to talk about. We'd see each other at a party. Hey, how are you? Fine, how are you? And there was nothing more to talk about. It wasn't that there wasn't anything there. It's that I don't think either of us felt comfortable talking about it. And then the years went by, and the last few years, when you have a relationship that's existed that long, and you can't help but to really care and love that person. And David and I have become much more comfortable with understanding and acknowledging our feelings. At the time, I think it was probably more difficult. But when we got on camera, it was all there. It was really interesting.
So how did you see the relationship between Starsky and Hutch? They're kind of like a yin and yang almost.
Yeah, I was always, looking at things from a different place, an idiosyncratic place. Starsky could get a bee in his bonnet about some idea or something, and Hutch was much more of a right down the middle kind of guy, and so we'd play off one another. And to the extent that David and I were both basically taking on the world of television, the world of stasis, the world of comfortably defined roles that everyone fell into in that game, we were kind of joined at the hip. So as uncomfortable as we might have been as younger men with our feelings, we weren't uncomfortable with them in front of the camera, and we were joined in this destiny. We were joined to do the best we could possibly do with with the show. I tended to be more vocal. David was more hail fellow, well met, in terms of, he didn't want to rock the boat, and I was all about rocking the boat, especially when I felt like they weren't listening. So I got the reputation of being the bad boy, of being the difficult one. And through it all, we definitely, we understood something about what we were doing there intuitively, in terms of how we did what we did. I mean, it wasn't all roses, and it wasn't all, always wonderful. We'd have our times when we'd fight and we'd disagree or whatever, but there was definitely an understanding of in the show. There's that me and thee. You know, who do we depend on? Me and thee. And to the extent that anything that really, really works, be it a story, a movie, a TV show, a painting, or whatever, when the reality of the doing process is parallel to the reality of the characters, you usually get a really good synergy. And I think that was, to a large extent, it was David and I against the establishment. You know, we had differing ways of dealing with it. But I think that was an emotional and psychological bond that was important, you know. And we made no bones about how we wanted to be treated ourselves and how to treat the other performers, you know, and the good directors. The bad directors, we'd let them know also.
Who were some of the people you thought were good directors?
Oh, well, you know, Sean Penn's dad, Leo Penn, was one of my favorites. He was just an easygoing guy who'd seen and done an awful lot, and he was a delight, you know. There was a guy named Bob Keljan, who unfortunately isn't with us anymore, and he was a guy that really, really cared. And there was a guy named Sutton Rowley, who had kept the camera in the back trunk of his car, and Sutton he was really he was lovely, and there were a bunch of them. There were a bunch of, and then there were, you know, a bunch of the guys that, you know, come in because that's the job they do.
So you actually directed 5 episodes yourself.
I directed 5 episodes.
Did you shadow any of those directors you just mentioned to kind of learn the ropes? Or how did you learn to do TV directing?
I guess I just paid attention.
Yeah.
You know, the first show I directed, they were all waiting for me to go belly up.
How was the
But
first
I
time?
didn't.
How was that first time directing?
Well, ass bites chair. So it was it was difficult. It was difficult, but it was you know, it was interesting. I mean, you know, you don't know what you're doing basically. You're just, you know, trying to shoot the schedule and get things, you know, and you have a few images in your mind you'd like to put together. Mm-hmm. But it was very much, you know, it was getting your feet wet.
How did your co-stars react to you in that role?
I think everyone reacted pretty well. You know, we're all in the same boat.
David directed as well, didn't he?
Dave's a very good director. He directed 2 or 3, I don't remember which. And, you know, he did a good job.
Do you think the fact that you're an actor as well influenced the way that you directed?
Oh, yeah.
How so?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, it gives you an appreciation of what it is to be an actor. Mm-hmm. You know, in terms of how do you get a performance from somebody? How do you get those moments? You know, directing can be, and often is, a very manipulative function or job in terms of getting the people to do their best. And I remember I was directing this show where David was posing as a paramedic, and he goes into this house, and he's got the grandmother and the granddaughter there, and through the whole show, Starsky's trying to get in, and eventually does. And we were shooting the last scene before Starsky comes in. It was a long scene where the tension is really ratcheting up and the people are starting to break. And I shot, it was like 4 pages or 5 pages, and I shot them. I put 1,000-foot mags on the cameras, and I just shot them all the way through. But I didn't shoot Kitty Harold, who played the granddaughter, till last. And I did that intentionally because she was the one who was most vulnerable to the stress and the tension. She was the one that was having the most difficulty. And through the whole work on the scene, she'd constantly come up to me and say, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do. And I'd say, it's okay, relax, we'll get there, and you'll be fine. And then it came time to do her shot. And she looked at me and she said, I don't know what to do. I've told you this, I don't know what to do. I said, that's your reality. Roll the camera. And she gave a wonderful performance. So to that extent, I was manipulating. I was creating a situation where I could hopefully get enough good moments that I could cut the scene around. Mm-hmm.
So let's go back and we'll talk about a couple of your other co-stars on the show. Antonio Fargas as Huggy Bear.
Tony's a sweetheart.
Yeah.
He's a sweetheart. He was trying to find himself also at that time, and was having his issues. I wasn't aware of them completely, but you know, he's a very sweet guy, very caring human being. I like Tony a lot. I like Bernie Hamilton a lot. Bernie was, you know, he just had a heart of gold. He was just a lovely, lovely man. He'd forget where he was every once in a while, or, you know, he'd do things that would go, what? What are you doing, Bernie? But he was the first to laugh at himself, and he was a really caring guy. I like Bernie, too.
So we've talked a little bit about, well, the show was a huge success pretty much right off the bat, and you were kind of catapulted into the spotlight. And how did you deal with that, or what was that like for you?
I didn't deal with it well at all.
Yeah.
You know, the story I often tell is that when I was in New York, waiting on table, attending bar, and then drinking my unemployment checks with my fellow unemployed actors on Friday nights, and we'd all hang around and we'd say, I'd never go to Hollywood. I'd go there to do a gig, but I wouldn't live there. I'm an actor. And then when Norman Jewison asked me to come out here to do a screen test for Fiddler, the joke I tell on myself is the very first thing I did was I went to Bally's shoe store on 6th Avenue and I bought a pair of white loafers. I didn't understand the significance of that until I became a celebrity. And then I realized how much a part of me had this fantasy, however unspoken, that if I became a celebrity, I'd be complete. If I became famous, I'd be complete. Of course, the minute I did, then I realized that I'd made a deal with the devil. You know, you lose your anonymity and you lose a lot of things. You get a bunch of perks, and you give up a lot. The reason I tell that story about myself is that when I became a celebrity, I found myself defining it to people. I'd say, well, you know, people create their gods in order to eat them. We take a human being that we know is human, flesh and blood. We endow them with the properties of a god, ability to, in the clutch, overcome their fear of failure or their fear of death, and deliver the goods. and they become larger than life to us. And then in that larger than life, we start to endow them with our version of who they are. The more available or approachable or touchable a performer is in his performance, the more human he is, the stronger the connection. Then, when you meet this person, you want an autograph, you want a photograph, a piece of the clothing, shake a hand, hug. What you're really doing in psychological terms is you're really trying to get a piece of that part of the person that's a god for yourself, because you want to know that you're capable of overcoming your fear. So when you're a celebrity, what you encounter with people is their agendas, which oftentimes has nothing to do with who you are. And then, if you survive long enough, you get to the point where you understand that that's all of our journey, and you become more accepting and more compassionate like that. I mean, I was once at a birthday party for Buddy Hackett, and standing there near the ice sculpture where all the seafood was, and I heard a voice behind me that I really knew, and I turned around and I was face to face with Cary Grant. We all have our gods. We all have our people that we worship.
What was your conversation with Cary Grant like?
That was it. You walked away. Oh, gosh.
Well, so back in the 1970s then, did you, when you went out in public, did you always get recognized? Did people mob you, or what was it like?
Yeah, it was just, it got very intense.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't very, very tactful with it. I just kind of head the other way, or try to explain people what was objectionable about halting a forkful of food halfway to my mouth to say hello to somebody.
Did the press hound you as well?
Yeah, the press was there. It's all there. Now, I can't even comprehend how people deal with it, because it's, on one hand, you want to be au courant, so you're going to be Twittered and Facebooked and all of that, and on the other hand, the fishbowl that you're in is becoming, bigger and bigger, or smaller and smaller, which way you want to talk about it.
Did you have to make any public appearances or do any promotional stuff for the show?
Yeah, we did the affiliate show, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And, and then we did a fair amount of publicity. I always made the mistake of thinking that because the other person spoke English who was asking me the questions, they understood what I was saying. Oftentimes they didn't, or they take it out of context and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. It's an education.
Mm-hmm. Are there any favorite episodes that you have of Starsky and Hutch, or memorable moments?
I can't remember too many of them. I didn't see a lot of them. I didn't watch the show. I watched the ones I directed.
Did you find that helpful as a director?
Yeah, you see things you do and you do differently and that kind of thing. You always learn. Yeah, I mean, you always want a position to learn. Learning is what it's all about. It's not the finished product. It's the journey. Mm-hmm. But no, I didn't watch the show. As a matter of fact, recently there was a couple of events that I was with David, and we were looking at the show, and I couldn't remember having done these things. And I thought, my gosh, look at that. But some of the stuff was really good, and some of the stuff was plain awful.
Fair enough. So Starsky and Hutch came to an end in 1979. How did you learn that the series was ending?
Well, the end of the first year, I tried to get out of the show. I sued to get out. I wasn't very happy. And then when I came back, I had 4 years left of my contract, and I met with the producers, Len Goldberg, Aaron Spelling, and I said, look, I actually said this to Len, I just want you to know why I've come back. I've come back because I want to learn how to direct. So, you know, that's what I'm doing here, and I'll honor this contract till it's over. And we continue to wrestle with them, and you know, and it was a struggle. Every year was a struggle. And the fourth year, we heard that they weren't going to pick us up. They were going to replace us with Heart to Heart. They'd made a deal with the network, with ABC. And so it was kind of like a mutual, you know, we all agreed that it was time to end it.
And you directed that last episode.
Yeah.
What was that like to direct and shoot the final one?
Well, it was fine. It was. I was shooting the opening scene where Starsky gets shot, and so I had the special effects guys load up a bunch of squibs in my jacket. And so when they shot me, there was this line of machine gun bullets. So nobody would survive that. And when the network saw that, they said, well, you can't kill Starsky. You
So
know,
was he
keeping their
supposed to die?
options, keeping their options open.
He was supposed to die, actually?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I was going to kill him. But they didn't want that.
Were you satisfied with the finale as the end of the show?
It was what it was. You know, we had some good moments, some good laughs. You know, I didn't, maybe this is the way I look at it now, but I think for me, it's how many of those moments you can have, those moments between David and I or whomever, where something more than just words get said. And when you have that happen, then it's a boon. It's a good thing.
So what do you think the legacy of Starsky and Hutch is?
The legacy?
Mm-hmm.
It's worth to care. It's worth it to care. It's important to care.
It's often described as the first buddy cop series. You think that's accurate? Well, let's move on to some of your other projects that you did during and after the run of Starsky and Hutch. In 1976, you played Harry Houdini in the TV movie The Great Houdini. How did that come about?
Mel Shabelson produced, wrote, and directed it. And it was during a hiatus. And at that time, during the hiatuses, I was always looking for a film to do. But that was at a time when the transition from television to film still wasn't happening. So he had this project, Houdini, and wanted me to play Houdini. And I said, absolutely. And that was an interesting experience shooting that film.
How so?
Wow. I did some of Harry's tricks.
Mm-hmm.
I did the water closet where he gets put in upside down. And it was the original water closet. Well, I'm about, 4 inches taller or 5 inches taller than Harry Houdini was. So I went into that closet. I couldn't turn around. We had our moments. We had our moments where, close calls. I don't even remember that much of the film, but it was a good group. We had Ruth,
Gordon
and Sally.
Struthers.
Yeah, and
I think Vivian Vance was in that as
Vivian
well.
Vance and what's his name? Wonderful guy, English actor.
I don't know who the other one was.
I can't believe it. I even think Wilfred Hyde White was there. Anyways, it was a nice experience, and Mel Shableton was just a wonderful man, wonderful man.
And in 1980, you starred in Phobia.
Yeah, that film I turned down. I was offered that film, I turned it down. Then they came back because they had attached John Huston.
So that reeled you in?
And I said, well, an opportunity to work with John Huston. So off I went to Canada to work with John. And I was all eager to work on the script and to talk about it and figure it out and da-da-da. John wasn't interested in that. John was basically interested in his book that he was writing, and he'd just been relieved of because of insurance problems from directing High Road to China. And apparently he needed the money. And so that's the John that I encountered. Very pleasant guy, very good eye, really had a nice eye, but more of a raconteur, more of a storyteller in terms of his enjoyment of the time spent on the set, his enjoyment of time with people,
Were you able to pick up anything about directing from him then, or not so
Oh,
much?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. He would sit. I would never go to dailies. I refused to go to dailies. And John would always print, not always, but 99% of the time he'd print the first thing that was good for sound and good for camera. Good for sound, good for camera, print it. Let's move on. And one day I said, could I just have a mercy hump? Could I just do one? He says, okay, if you come to dailies. I said, all right, I'll come to dailies. So I came to dailies, and I was sitting at dailies, and they finished. And all the department heads surrounded us. We were sitting in the front row. And they started asking John production questions. What do we do about this? What do we do about that? What do we do about that? And John's MO is basically not to say anything and let everyone else figure it out. And I, of course, created this theory that, well, when you do that, you cause everyone to roll up their sleeves and work even harder. That introduced me to the whole notion of how do you frame a process and how do you frame the working relationship with a crew and with actors. Which I thought was really interesting. So that when I finally started directing film, I would oftentimes find myself saying to my crew, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if we can do it. I mean, I have this idea of doing this, and I'd already figured out what I knew what I wanted to do. I knew it. But if I said it that way, then invariably one guy would say, oh, we can do that. Hey, and when we can do this to someone else. And before you know it, everyone is invested in the shot. To the extent that when we call action, they're watching the shot. They're watching the actors, and all of that energy around the camera is being focused in front of the camera. And that has an impact on the celluloid at some very primal level. So I learned that, and but John he wasn't as much a director to me, although I kept wanting to be a director, as he was a personality and a piece of Hollywood history, and he had survived so long in that world, and that to me was, that was worth the price of admission.
Mm-hmm. So you continued to direct episodic television after Starsky and Hutch. You did 3 episodes of Miami Vice in '84 and '85.
Michael Mann had been a story editor on Starsky and Hutch. And when he got Miami Vice, were having lunch one day, and he asked if I'd like to direct a few of the episodes. I said, sure. And that was quite a cool experience because Michael had wrangled a situation where this was the first series that Miami ever had. It was the first series that was functioning outside a studio on the East Coast with the East Coast unions and all of that. And so Miami couldn't do enough to help us. And the studio, being on the other side of the country, didn't have an awful lot of oversight. So we got to do an awful lot on our own. And, and try things, and, and Michael was always a big proponent of that, to do what you like to do. And so that's what I did, and I enjoyed it.
So Miami Vice had kind of a really specific style. Did you?
Well,
find
it had a style, but my eye, I've always thought that my eye is similar to Michael's. And so I didn't have any problem with any of that. And the color palette was the color palette. And,
And you were actually nominated for a Primetime Emmy for one of those episodes, for Smuggler's Blues.
That was, with Glenn Fry, yeah.
What was that like to be nominated?
I'll tell you, I sat at the DGA meeting, dinner, with that picture of, what's his name, the founder. It looks a little bit like Lenin. It's up there in this picture in front of a red curtain. And I sat there, and this is when I still allowed smoking indoors, and I smoked a whole pack of cigarettes. I was so nervous that I would be called up on stage and I have to say something.
So that was for the DGA Awards then?
Yeah.
Okay. Nice. And then also that same year, 1985, you directed your first feature, which was Band of the Hand.
Right. Michael had called me. I was cutting his 2-hour opener that I directed for Vice, and he asked me if I was interested in doing a feature. Hello, that's what, yeah. And so I got my feet wet in the feature directing world, and I learned the difference between directing a feature and directing a TV show.
Which was what?
Well, the director has far more responsibility, and therefore, and I use this word very carefully, power, because the only amount of power you really have is the amount of power you're willing to give up, or control is a better word than power. But I didn't realize the extent to which signing off on the budget and the schedule, if I had been smarter, if I had been more production smart, I wouldn't have started the film the way we started it, because we started it in the Everglades, chest high in water, and in 2 weeks I was a week behind. And Jeff Sagansky, who was the head of TriStar, was distributing the film, started calling for my head. Michael, who tends to have his own stubborn streak, said, I won't cut the script, and I won't let you fire Paul. Well, the third time it happened, they made a stink. I really put my foot in it. I called Sagansky up and I said, let me explain something to you. My objective in directing a movie, my first movie, is to bring it in on time and on budget. That's all I really care about. Yeah, I want it to be good, but that's my priority. If you raise the question of me being fired one more time, I'm going to quit. And until then, let me tell you one more thing. I don't give a rat's ass how much this film costs or how long it takes. Well, that got me blacklisted. I didn't direct for a long time after that. But I was, I was emotionally immature, and I was, I believed that people I was naive. I was naive.
You did direct another film shortly after that, The Running Man.
Well, The Running Man came, yeah, that was the first film. It wasn't that, what's the separation of time?
2 years. That was
2
87.
years, yeah. That was the 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Rob Cohen was producing that. And he asked me if I'd be interested in directing it. He'd seen some of my work and was a fan. And I, after having done Band of the Hand, I said, well, how much time do you have to prepare? They said 2.5 months. Pass. I didn't want to get myself in a situation again. And then 2 weeks, then they hired Andy Davis, and then 2 weeks into photography, they were a week behind. And the first 2 weeks of a movie, a head must roll. And so they fired Andy, and they came to me and asked me if I'd take it over. That was on a Thursday. And I said, well, how long will you shut down for? And they said, the weekend. So I said, okay, I'll do it, because it was a win-win. I mean, if the film worked, I was a hero, and if it didn't work, poor Andy was the bad guy. So that was what that was about, yeah.
And you worked with Arnold Schwarzenegger on that?
I worked with Arnold, and, you know, it was really, thanks to my experience in television, it was really all about, for the first while, for a long time, it was about problem solving. Getting the film back on track and giving it a look that, and a style that, you know. The film was produced by Tim Zinnemann, the line producer, and Tim was Fred Zinnemann's son. And Tim had done an excellent job. I mean, he had the thing, he had it, you know, dialed in. And so while it was a bit of a challenge, it was not, I was not left wanting with, you know, a line producer. He was terrific.
And then in 1990, you and your wife Elizabeth appeared on 60 Minutes with Ed Bradley. So talk about your decision to go public with everything.
Well, the
that
press was
happening.
getting to us. The press they were getting closer and closer. They were trying all kinds of tricks to, you know, to find out our story, and they were posing as rabbis and doctors, and it was really ludicrous. And we realized that it was just a matter of time, so we decided to take the initiative and go public ourselves.
So did you reach out to 60 Minutes, or did they contact you?
Well, no, I think we reached out. We decided what's the best format to go in.
Mm-hmm. And what was the reaction after that show aired?
You know, that whole period of my life is kind of like what I imagined it to be like, to be a soldier in Vietnam. You know, it's a big blur. You know, people were accepting, understanding, horrified, compassionate, pitying, confused, unable to talk about it, avoiding. There were people that avoided us because they couldn't deal with this reality or this degree of helplessness, which is what I came to understand it to be.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and by that time we had engaged in a battle, and our heads were down, and one foot after the other.
Could you explain what actually was going on with your family at that time? Could you explain what was going on with your family at that time?
That's the best I can do.
Okay. And you spoke before Congress during this period.
Yes.
So what did you testify and say, and why did you feel the need to do that?
Well, the first time was what we were testifying about, what we'd learned. Elizabeth created the Pediatric AIDS Foundation, right? And what she'd learned and we'd learned from that, among other things, was that the pharmaceutical companies did not dose for children. And you could pick up medication for a child, and there was no dosage for the child that age. And the reason why that was that they didn't perceive children as being the marketplace. The marketplace was older people, because Western medicine is more about treating the symptoms than treating the cause. And the pharmaceutical companies are far more driven by profit than altruism. They're more driven by profit than helping people towards better health. You must not confuse the word relief with better health. Better health has to deal with the cause. Relief has to deal with the symptom. So we testified, and and that began a movement where the pharmaceutical companies, to some degree, were brought into line and had to start dosing for children. Unfortunately, what happened was that the way the thing had been written, it allowed the pharmaceutical companies to claim an exemption from going generic for any drug that they were testing for children. And all of a sudden, they were putting drugs on there they were testing for children, which were ridiculous. And so Congress was up in arms and angry, and they wanted to kill the whole program. And so we had to testify again, basically saying, better the devil you know than the one you don't know. At least we're getting some research, we're getting some dosing, we're getting some cooperation from the pharmaceutical companies. But they're still, they're still outright thieves. And it's tragic to the extent to which greed has really come to rule the roost in this country and in the world.
Mm-hmm. And around that time, you also directed then President Reagan in an AIDS awareness PSA.
Yeah, my wife, they were doing it, and they asked me if I liked to direct it. Sure, why not,
Was that done at the White House? Or?
No, we shot it at the Bel Air Hotel.
Mm-hmm. And so Reagan had famously been an actor. What was it like to direct him?
Say your words. I never thought of him as an actor.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit.
But I never thought of him as a president either.
So during that period in the 90s, you continued to direct a few more films. We'll touch on some of those. The Cutting Edge in 1992.
Yeah, Cutting Edge was my favorite. Alan Ladd Jr., Laddie, who was the head of MGM at the time, got in touch with me and said, you might really enjoy directing this. And I read it, and I said, yes, I would. I'd grown up in Boston. I'd done a lot of skating and hockey and all of that. And it was romantic comedy. So I went to meet with the producer, Robert Court, and he had one of his executives, this young lady there. And halfway through the meeting, she says, you're ruining all the characters. Because I'm trying to talk about what the real psychological dynamic is with these characters, because if you can figure out the darker side of a character, it's going to teach you the funniest side. And that's just the way I work. And so after the meeting, I called Laddie and I said, didn't go too well. I'd like another meeting without her there. And I walked in to the second meeting and I said to Robert, who's since become one of my closest friends, I said, there's an elephant in the room. You don't know if I can direct a romantic comedy given the story of my family. I said, you're right. I said, well, I can, and this is how I do it, and I told him all about it. And then he was left to mull it over, and at the last second, he decided to go with me, to his credit. And we put together a pretty good movie.
And you also directed The Air Up There in 1994.
The Air Up There was a fluke. Elizabeth had died 2 months previously. Friends of mine, of ours, called to ask if Jake would like to meet Shaquille O'Neal, at the All-Star game in Arizona.
And Jake
I
is
was
your
taking
son?
him there. Yeah, Jake's my son. And so I said, sure. And they said, by the way, do you know any good film roles for Shaquille? He has some time free this summer before basketball camp. I said, no, you got to play a genie. And I hung up the phone. And I thought about it. And I put together a story idea. And I met Shaquille, and I met his manager. And I said, when's basketball camp? And they told me, and I back-timed it. And I said, okay, I have 10 and a half weeks to get a script and a green light. And I did it. It was more about having to get back to work, being the mother of this particular level of invention, because you never get a film together that fast, ever, ever, ever. And when you look at the movie, you can see that it was put together pretty fast. But it was a nice idea. I liked the idea.
And that's Kazam. And how was it to direct? Your son had a small role in that.
Oh, nothing. No. Do whatever you want to do.
Then in 1996, you became chairman of the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation. Could you talk a little bit about your role and the mission of the organization?
Well, I took over as chair, not knowing exactly what a chair did, what the responsibilities were. So I had a bit of a learning curve there. What became really evident was that science and medicine had made enough of an inroad into their research and the medicines, that they had created enough of an illusion that science and medicine had the whole thing under control. It was no longer the darling disease of Hollywood. It was no longer considered a huge threat to everybody. And so people had become very complacent. Well, it became really evident that one had to make a case for relevancy of HIV research in that world. Because, as we all know, research money, like any seed money, is very hard to come by. And when the economy gets tight, that gets even harder to find. When Elizabeth created the foundation and when she was involved with it, her attitude wasn't why, it was why not. And she would never accept no. She'd say, we're going to get to this level. How are we going to do it? We'll figure it out. And that kind of an attitude where you're willing to kind of jump off the cliff is the core dynamic of creativity, taking chances, being willing to fail. Not everybody has that. Coming from a creative world, I think I was most familiar with that. And so I was saying to the board of the foundation, we need to really make a case for the relevancy of HIV research. Well, how do we do that? Well, Elizabeth had created this thing with called collaborative research. What was it called? It was a discipline, collaborative research, in which they funded for 7-year cycles scientists for projects that the scientists would propose, and then with the proviso that those scientists collaborate. They share their findings with each other. They work together. And that, to that point, was not done. It was never done. And then I went to a dinner where we were going to announce the next year's recipients. And I sat with a bunch of the scientists and we were talking. And I asked them, I said, look, do you learn things from HIV/AIDS research that gives you an insight into cancer or any other diseases? And they said, absolutely. I said, is it published? I said, no. And so I started to talk with Phil Pizzo, who's the dean of Stanford Medical School, and who was on our board, about doing an idea. Elizabeth had talked about having a hospital where all these families would come. Phil and I started talking about an idea where you would get a bunch of teaching hospitals. Our first group was Boston University, Stanford, UCLA, UCSF, and Baylor. And you get these teaching hospitals that have affiliated hospitals, you know, the universities and hospitals. And you get them to collaborate on pediatric diseases, life-threatening pediatric diseases, so that they are sharing their resources. And the second half of the idea, which was really interesting, I thought, was that you also treat diseases as collaborative. In other words, you don't choose a protocol by narrowing your view, but rather widening your view. You say, okay, I want to study this. Okay, now how can I do it that includes possibilities of other issues? How can I increase the amount of questions? Because all the things we learn in this life are accidents. They're all from left field. So you want to create an opportunity for that to happen. So if you think of the world of disease as collaborative, they collaborate. See how they collaborate. See how they respond, react to each other. And to me, from my way of thinking, it became very clear that if you explain to people that while HIV virus affects the immune system, studying it, doing research on it, is only going to teach you much more about the other things that the immune system has to deal with, not to mention all those things that are going to come down the pike that Mother Nature has prepared on this planet that is getting bigger in population and smaller in resources, where organisms are losing their hosts. You know, species are dying off, and these organisms need to find other places to live, and they're far more malleable and they're far more adaptive than we are. Mm-hmm. And it would be foolish for us to assume that we are going to adapt as well as they do. So we know there's going to be other stuff coming down the turnpike. We just know it. So wouldn't it make sense to use every resource to study as much as we can, and here the HIV virus, instead of being a scourge, instead of being a horrible thing, it becomes a really enormous opportunity to learn. I thought that makes the case.
Absolutely.
Well, any captain of industry that I spoke to got it within seconds. I must have explained it to my board 24 times. Still didn't get it. Because it required raising money when raising money was becoming more and more difficult. So they didn't have the equipment, they didn't have the intellectual ability or the psychological ability to be able to sit with the fear of failure, like Elizabeth sat with the fear of the mortality of herself and her 2 children. To sit with that fear and choose to do things, to pursue things that seemed unattainable.
We have to stop there to change the tape.